under a sky washed in deep indigo, where the highway outside Birmingham, Alabama, stretched like a lonely ribbon and the streetlights danced in erratic flickers against the damp pavement, the night whispered secrets of isolation and vulnerability. In that eerie, near-deserted stretch, just past 11 p.m. when most souls sought refuge at home, a few distant cars skimmed by, their headlights ricocheting off slick asphalt, setting long, quivering shadows in motion. Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson had been on the road for nearly 2 hours. Her fingers tapped a restless, staccato rhythm on the steering wheel, perfectly in sync with the muted strains of an old jazz record crackling through her speakers. Clad in a simple black sweater and well-worn jeans, her hair pulled back into a practical bun, she believed herself to be an ordinary traveler, hardly someone who drew attention. Yet destiny had different plans. Without warning, the rearview mirror burst into life with flashing red and blue, a frenzied ballet of lights closing in. Renee's pulse quickened, not from sheer terror but from the exhaustion of a long day, the familiar dread that accompanied encounters like these. With a measured calm born of military discipline, she signaled, shifted lanes, and eased her car onto the broad, lonely shoulder. Parking with deliberate care, she drew a slow, steady breath and kept her hands conspicuously on the wheel, a silent salute to the protocols she'd internalized over years of service. From behind in a gleaming patrol car, a pristine, drill-white vehicle that seemed to declare its own authority, the officer emerged. His heavy boots pounded the wet asphalt as he advanced, each step resonating with the certainty of one who expected unquestioning compliance. A beam of his flashlight danced across the vehicle's interior, and as Renee's eyes flicked sideways, she caught a glimpse of his badge gleaming in the dim light. The name Briggs scrolled in harsh metallic letters. No greeting, no pleasantry, his tone was as flat and rehearsed as an overused script. "Were you speeding?" he barked, his voice clipped and impatient, as he retrieved her documents from the glove compartment with an almost dismissive air. His eyes roved over her car, the tail lights, he noted with a sneer, were out. Renee's brow furrowed in quiet disbelief. "That can't be right," she murmured, her tone even and measured. For a suspended moment, the space between them seemed charged with an invisible duel, a silent battle where authority met resolute defiance. "Are you arguing with me?" Briggs demanded, his voice a harsh whisper slicing through the night. The silence that followed crackled like static in the air, a moment when the weight of power pressed down, expecting submission. Renee's military training, honed in distant, harsher theaters, urged caution. "I'm just saying my taillights were checked weeks ago. If there's an issue, I can have them fixed immediately," she replied, her voice calm but laced with quiet steel. Without another word, Briggs ordered, "Step out of the car." His tone brooked no debate. As she hesitated, a fleeting thought, "Mind telling me why?" crossed her mind. Briggs's lips curled into a smirk as he responded coolly, "Because I said so." With a mechanical precision, he unbuckled her seatbelt and flung open the door. The cool night air, unexpected and brisk, greeted her as she stepped onto the pavement. Her posture was relaxed yet alert, she wasn't searching for a brawl, but she would never allow herself to be cowed. As Briggs advanced, his gaze appraising her every nuance, the power dynamics shifted visibly. "Are you resisting?" he inquired, stepping closer until his earlier arrogance gave way to an undercurrent of irritation. "No," she answered softly, "I'm merely asking a question." For an instant, the air between them pulsed with unspoken challenge, a duel of wills that reminded her all too well of training exercises back on base, where defiance and protocol danced a dangerous waltz. Abruptly, his hand reached for the radio. "Got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered, the words crackling through the static as he barked, "Turn around!" His pulse of authority surged, and as his voice deepened, he added, "Officer, you need to understand something. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I know what you can't do." Before she could gather her thoughts, his arm lashed out. "You're under arrest," he snapped, his grip darting for her wrist. Reflexively, Renee stepped back just enough to thwart his clumsy grasp. In that charged instant, as he produced a pair of cold, unforgiving cuffs, her mind raced with the same calculation that had seen her through combat drills and high-stakes missions overseas. There were only two choices now: comply with his forceful intrusion, or push back and risk further escalation. Choosing the path of measured defiance, she slowly placed her hands on the cool metal roof of her car, her touch deliberate, a final act of resistance. Briggs, seizing the moment, yanked her arms behind her with a force that belied his training. The cuffs snapped shut around her wrists, biting into her skin as if to mark his dominance. "You don't know what you're doing," he growled, shoving her roughly into the back seat of his patrol car. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing," she managed, her tone icy even as the harsh plastic seat dug into her back. Inside the patrol car, the world shrank to a partition separating her from his smug presence. The red and blue flashes danced in the side mirrors, tainting the wet road with errant hues of authority and defiance. As Briggs whistled a sardonic tune, well, he secured his own belt with a casual flick of the wrist and remarked, "Most people just keep their mouths shut when I tell them to step out." His voice dripped with condescension as he continued, "You really must think you're somebody." Renee's eyes met his in the mirror, her silence a tacit refusal to play his game. "You military, huh?" he prodded, his tone shifting to a mix of begrudging respect and sneering contempt. She merely nodded slightly, a silent affirmation of her inner resolve. "Bet you thought I'd back off, didn't you?" he taunted. Still, Renee said nothing, her silence as potent as any retort. His next words, "If you'd just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this," dripped like venom, yet her gaze remained unwavering. The patrol car finally wheeled into a squat, gray brick building that served as the local station, a place where time seemed to slow amid stale coffee aromas and the hum of fluorescent lights. Inside, the air was heavy with indifference. The parking lot lay nearly barren, a testament to the lateness of the hour. Briggs pulled into a reserved space near the entrance, snuffed out the engine, and turned to survey her with a satisfied sneer. "I do love it when they make it easy," he murmured, his tone laced with self-satisfaction. Before Renee could muster a reply, Briggs was out the door, slam, bang, and she found herself being led inside past a desk-bound sergeant whose vacant eyes betrayed years of monotony. The holding area reeked of stale sweat and bitter coffee, its metal bench a stark reminder of the indifference that allowed men like Briggs to flourish. For the rest of the booking process, a blur of fingerprinting, mug shots, and perfunctory paperwork, the officers moved mechanically, their eyes glazed over as if to say that defiance was a luxury they couldn't afford. When the process finally ended, Briggs grasped her wrist once more, this time with a rough familiarity that was both patronizing and possessive. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he muttered, shoving her toward a cold, metal cell. Renee's eyes flickered with quiet determination as the heavy bars clanged shut behind her. "I don't have to think," she whispered under her breath, her voice steady despite the burning sting of the cuffs. As Briggs's footsteps faded away, she settled onto the unyielding bench, the chill of the metal seeping through her jeans, grounding her in the reality that this was only the beginning. Inside the claustrophobic cell, for bare walls, a solitary, flickering light overhead, and the pervasive odor of disinfectant and old sweat, Renee recalled nights spent in far harsher places. Yet, despite the bleak surroundings, a quiet fury smoldered beneath her calm exterior. She listened to the muted chorus of distant shuffling footsteps, the occasional clatter of a coffee cup against a desk in the processing area, each sound a reminder of the system's indifference. Slowly, her breathing steadied, a mantra learned in basic training: control the mind, control the body. Then came heavy footsteps, different from the earlier, measured strides of Briggs. She recognized his presence before he appeared. With an arrogant gait that once signified untouchability, Briggs reappeared at the cell door, arms folded and that same smirk plastered on his face. "If you'd just played along, you wouldn't be in here, right?" he taunted, his voice low but biting. Renee's eyes glittered with defiance. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied, her tone as calm as the eye of a storm. For a moment, the cell seemed to shrink around them, the charged silence punctuated only by Briggs's condescending chuckle. "Here's the thing," he murmured, leaning in so that his breath, laced with the acrid tang of authority, brushed against the bars. "People like you think the rules don't apply, like a little confidence can get you out of trouble." He let the sentence hang, a thinly veiled threat, before another presence disrupted the tension. A younger officer, barely in his late 20s and clutching a clipboard as if it were a lifeline, approached hesitantly from the corridor. "Sergeant," the man began, his voice wavering with uncertainty, "we got a call." His words trailed off as Briggs's eyes narrowed, and the younger officer shifted awkwardly. "I think you need to see this," the newcomer insisted, his tone cautious yet urgent. Briggs's face darkened, and with one last hard look at Renee, he stepped away. The conversation that ensued was a muted murmur, half-heard fragments of a discussion involving a lawyer, a call from higher up, questions about the legality of her detention. Through the thin cell door, Renee picked up bits and pieces, references to internal reviews, to the disproportionate targeting of black drivers, and to the possibility that the scales of power might finally be tipping. Moments later, the heavy thud of approaching footsteps announced Briggs's return. His jaw was set, fists clenched at his sides, and his familiar smirk had evaporated, replaced by a scowl of barely contained fury. "What the hell did you do?" he demanded, his voice a mix of anger and confusion. Renee, resting her elbows on her knees, met his glare coolly. "I did nothing," she replied softly. When he insinuated that her connections must be at work, she simply tilted her head, a quiet rebuke to his baseless assumptions. In that charged moment, it was clear that the balance of power was shifting. Briggs no longer held all the cards. When dawn finally broke, the courthouse emerged from the pre-dawn gloom like a bastion of cold justice. Morning light spilled through narrow windows, scattering long, deliberate streaks across polished floors. Inside, the air was brisk and unforgiving, a reminder that even the stillest moments could chill you to the bone if you lingered too long. Renee now stood near a long table marked defendant, her presence transformed from captive to resolute force. Gone were the handcuffs and the drab orange jumpsuit. Instead, she wore a finely tailored navy blazer over a simple blouse. Every inch of her radiated quiet authority. Beside her, her attorney, Carla Whitman, a woman of precise movements and efficient silence, flipped through a stack of papers as people slowly filed into the courtroom. No idle chatter, no superfluous niceties, everything here was stripped down to its essentials. At that moment, the heavy wooden doors at the back swung open with a reluctant creak, and in strode Briggs. He carried himself as though he still owned the room, shoulders squared, chin tilted, but now there was an unmistakable stiffness in his step, a tremor of uncertainty behind his eyes. Their gazes met briefly. Renee's were cool and unwavering, while Briggs quickly averted his, as if his fragile authority might shatter under scrutiny. The judge, an older man with the weariness of too many hard-fought battles etched into his lined face, entered next. Judge Alan Kirkland adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "All right," he said gravely, scanning the case files before him. "Let's get to it." With that, the prosecution began in earnest. A middle-aged man with impeccably combed hair rose to speak. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe that Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, new information suggests a pattern of misconduct on the part of the arresting officer." His words, measured and precise, rippled through the courtroom. A murmur of disquiet passed through the assembled crowd. Briggs shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening as the judge's gaze fell upon him. "Sergeant Briggs, care to explain?" the judge inquired, his tone both firm and expectant. Briggs leaned forward, clearing his throat as if preparing for a routine recitation. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop," he faltered as the prosecutor interjected sharply, "Uncooperative?" Lieutenant Commander Dawson's record speaks for itself, a distinguished career, multiple commendations, no criminal history. "And you claim a broken tail light justified this arrest?" The silence that followed was heavy with disapproval. Flipping through his documents, the prosecutor continued, "Moreover, an internal review of your arrest history reveals an alarming pattern, a disproportionate number of stops involving black drivers in this district." The courtroom buzzed with a low, accusatory hum as all eyes turned to Briggs, whose face darkened with each passing moment. Judge Kirkland sighed, setting his file down. "Sergeant Briggs, I don't like what I'm hearing." Briggs's attempts to defend himself with a shaky reference to standard procedure were met with skepticism. "Let's play the footage," the judge commanded. A screen descended at the front of the room, and the video began to play, a stark montage of Briggs's actions, the unnecessary escalation, the tightening of cuffs, the dismissive orders. The room fell into a hush as the evidence unfolded before them. When the footage ended, the judge leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Sergeant Briggs, you violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest and failed to report all the details accurately. The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson are hereby dismissed, and I strongly recommend a full internal investigation into your conduct." His gavel fell with a finality that reverberated through the silent courtroom. Briggs's face went ashen. It was as if a physical blow had struck him. His fists clenched at his sides, and his eyes burned with a mixture of anger and humiliation. Renee, meanwhile, exhaled slowly, her expression one of controlled triumph as she gathered her belongings. Their eyes met one last time, no words passed between them, yet in that silent exchange lay the irrevocable truth that the tide had turned. Briggs, stripped of his ill-gotten authority, stormed out of the courtroom, his heavy footsteps echoing down the gleaming corridors as whispers of scandal followed in his wake. Outside, the corridor buzzed with murmurs and the curious glances of officers, court staff, and even reporters who had gathered after news of the case began to spread. No longer was Briggs the unassailable figure he once believed himself to be, his control was crumbling like a castle of sand in retreat. And then, amid the swirling chaos, a sharper voice cut through the din. In a quiet corner of the building, Sergeant Daniel Briggs found himself face to face with Chief Eldon Baker, a veteran of over 30 years, his presence as immovable as the ancient stones that lined the courthouse. With arms crossed and an expression that blended disappointment and resolve, Chief Baker said nothing at first, merely studying Briggs with a look that pierced through the man's feigned bravado. After a long, waited pause, Baker motioned brusquely for Briggs to follow him into a private office. The door closed with a resolute thud, and inside, Baker's tone dropped to a cutting whisper. "What were you thinking?" he demanded. Briggs exhaled sharply, his voice defensive. "I was doing my job, your job," he snapped. Baker scoffed, tossing a thick file onto the desk with a heavy thud. "It doesn't look that way," he countered, his voice cold and measured. "The body cam footage, your arrest history, the fact that you didn't even know who you were arresting, all point to a gross abuse of power." Briggs's nostrils flared as he tried to muster a retort, but Baker pressed on. "This isn't some random encounter," Baker said, leaning forward so that every word cut through the silence. "This is a high-ranking Navy officer you just humiliated. And you, Briggs, have been flagged repeatedly for racial profiling. The district attorney is reviewing every case from the past 5 years, and it appears that you have been operating under a pattern of misconduct." As Baker's words sank in, Briggs felt a twisting in his gut, a foreboding sense that his once untouchable status was now in ruins. "Effective immediately, you are suspended," Baker declared, his tone final. "Internal Affairs will be investigating, and if they confirm my suspicions, your career is over." Briggs stood frozen, fists clenched at his sides as Baker's verdict struck him like a physical blow. His world, built on arrogance and unchecked authority, began to unravel in that moment. Across town, in the quiet hum of a neighborhood cafe where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the murmur of subdued conversations, Renee Dawson sat quietly at a corner table. As she stirred her coffee, her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. News headlines flashed across her screen: Lieutenant Commander wrongfully arrested, officer under investigation. Though she wasn't surprised by the story, the system had always favored the powerful, she allowed herself a small, inward nod. Her experience that night had been a prelude to a larger reckoning. A text soon arrived from her attorney, confirming that Briggs had been suspended and might even face charges. With a measured sip of her now cooling coffee, Renee glanced out the window at the bustling street. Life, it seemed, continued unabated despite the chaos of the previous hours. But she knew, deep in her core, that this was no isolated incident. Men like Briggs had long wielded their badges like weapons, preying on those too vulnerable to fight back. Moments later, her phone rang, a number she recognized immediately. Answering with a quiet, "Hello," she was met with the familiar, steady tone of her captain. "Lieutenant Commander," he began, his voice both reassuring and firm, "I assume you've seen the news?" After a brief pause, he inquired, "How are you holding up?" Renee's eyes caught her reflection in the shop window opposite, a reflection that showed no signs of defeat, not even the faintest crack in her resolve. "I feel as if I did exactly what needed to be done," she replied, her voice resolute. The captain's tone softened. "That's what I hoped you'd say. The Department of Defense has taken an interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak about it." A momentary silence ensued before Renee's measured reply. "I'm not exactly eager to be a headline, but," her captain interjected lightly, "you already are, whether you like it or not. What happened to you is a reflection of something far bigger than one incident." She understood perfectly. Briggs wasn't a rogue anomaly, he was a symptom of a system that had allowed the unchecked abuse of power to fester for far too long. As Renee leaned back against the streetlight, watching a mother amble by with her young son, his tiny hand gripping hers, his laughter carefree and pure, a deeper resolve took root within her. This struggle was not only for her own dignity but for every black boy and girl who deserved to grow up in a world free from the tyranny of unchecked authority. "You didn't back down," her captain continued, his voice firm. "And that makes all the difference." Renee closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle into her bones. She had refused to be bullied, whether it was on a dark, rain-slicked highway or in a courtroom where the scales of justice had finally begun to balance. Before ending the call, the captain added, "You might be getting a call from the mayor's office soon. They want to recognize you for handling the situation with professionalism and grace." Renee's eyebrows arched in a hint of irony as she allowed a small smile to tug at her lips. "Now that's something to think about," she replied, then ended the call and tucked her phone away. Stepping out of the cafe into the crisp afternoon air, a mixture of rain-washed concrete and the promise of renewal, Renee took a deep breath. The burdens of the past 24 hours might have weighed heavily on her shoulders, but now they were transformed into a quiet strength. With each step, her resolve grew firmer, her purpose clearer. This fight was never solely about one arrest or one officer's misconduct, it was about demanding accountability in a system that had long turned a blind eye to injustice. Across the street, a mother laughed joyfully with her young son, a picture of innocence and hope. In that simple, fleeting moment, Renee saw not just her own struggle but the future of every child who deserved better, a world where power was not abused, and where every voice, regardless of rank or background, could be heard. Her thoughts echoed in a quiet mantra as she walked, "Unchecked power is the seed of abuse, and only by challenging it can we hope to change the system." If her story made you think, if it stirred anger or a desire for justice, share it. Talk about it. Let it ignite the real conversations that lead to genuine change. Because the fight for accountability, and for a fair world, starts with each of us speaking up. In that final, resolute moment, as the afternoon light mingled with the echoes of a hard-won victory, Renee Dawson strode forward with head held high. The weight of injustice had been met, and a ripple of change had been set in motion. And though the battle against entrenched authority was far from over, today marked a turning point, a reminder that one determined soul could indeed shatter the illusion of untouchable power. Share this story. Let it be the spark that lights the flame of change. Real justice begins when we all refuse to be silent.